I mean, Europe's role as a foreign policy player, or its non-role as a foreign policy player, is really the kind of big unkept promise of the European integration process. While the economic integration and even political integration has progressed very, very far, on foreign policy, Europe, with its huge potential of 500 million people and its riches and strength, is hugely underperforming. And this is dangerous for two reasons. First of all, Europeans are unable to protect their interests around the world, which they depend upon. And secondly, they become less interesting and less useful for its main ally, the United States, who's still the main guarantor of Europe's security per se. And so, what should Europe aspire to? It should become a global player with a strategic outlook worthy of its size and worthy of its responsibilities around the world. But it should also become a player that can, together with the United States, guarantee the liberal world order, the kind of rules-based international system that we rely upon for our own economic well-being and for our physical security. The Europeans have not been doing this very well. They have relied for the most part on the Americans to pick up the tab and do it for them, but that's no longer an option. But for a globally kind of networked world in which Europe is a key node, you know, Europe needs to understand that it needs to do more, and this includes everything from more diplomacy to more military capabilities to back diplomacy up, to better ideas about development aid, and to a generally more outlooking kind of strategic culture. Right. So what are Europe's strategies and interests and priorities really for its external kind of dealings? I think the first major kind of global interest that the Europeans have is to keep this global liberal world order, this rules-based approach to international relations that keeps markets open and sea lanes open and basically establishes standards for state behavior in the international sphere, to keep that intact. And that is something that they can't do themselves. This is where they rely on the partnership with the United States, and this is where they need to be a better partner, but also a more kind of, conscious, self-conscious partner for the United States. So this is its key interest, but also one of its key priorities, to become that kind of player. Then, closer to home, of course, Europe has a primary strategic interest in a stable neighborhood. And this includes Eastern Europe, this includes the Middle East and Central Asia, this includes Northern Africa and the Sahel, and possibly even the Arctic, and in the wider sense also Russia. Here it needs to be, a lot more kind of sophisticated in the tools that it has. The European neighborhood policy, as it was devised a number of years ago, is not a sufficient tool anymore, even though it was just revamped. I think that is now a different kind of story that we have to tell. We have to think a lot more in terms of, the transformative power of Europe in that region outside expansion. That's a very difficult kind of policy to implement, but that will be very, very crucial, because Europe will not be free and stable and affluent if it can't also have a stable kind of belt around it of countries and regions where it will play an increasing role, especially since the Americans are going to be relatively weaker in Europe's neighborhood, and will ask the Europeans more to actually police the neighborhood themselves. I think that's the second priority and the second big interest. And then, of course, there's the internal dimension, which is inextricably intertwined with the external dimension. And it's the fact that we have both an economic problem in Europe, but also one of political legitimacy. We have a European Union that lacks the kind of back coupling to the voter, to the demos, to the real sovereign, that needs to be kind of administered in a different way. Politicians around Europe feel that citizens are less convinced that Europe is the right thing for them, and they feel that they are kind of detached from the decision making in Europe. So we need to drag these people back in. The only way to do this is participation. Let them vote. Let them vote at a European level. That sounds like science fiction at the moment, but I think that's the only way in the long run that we can actually tackle this kind of legitimacy problem, which threatens to undermine not only our internal cohesion, but also the role that we can play as an international actor.